The chandelier glittered like frozen fireworks above a sea of designer gowns and polished egos. The annual Celestine Charity Gala was the event of the year, where power was flaunted, reputations were traded like stocks, and generosity served as a thin veil for arrogance. Beneath the arch of a marbled staircase, flashbulbs popped as billionaires, media moguls, and fashion titans floated down in curated perfection. And then came Iris. Her dress was modest by comparison, handmade, clearly. A deep forest green with hand-stitched embroidery that shimmered only when the light hit it just right. It lacked the logos, the dramatic plunges, the pretension. Her heels were scuffed at the base. Her makeup was minimal, and worst of all, she didn't have a name anyone here cared to recognize anymore. For a moment, the noise of the gala dimmed around her, like the room was collectively holding its breath to decide whether to laugh or look away. She walked in alone, clutching a small envelope in her hand. No assistant, no PR manager, no camera crew, just Iris and the weight of a world that had discarded her 2 years ago. "She's still alive," someone whispered behind a champagne flute. "Thought she ran off after that scandal." "She designs for Etsy now, doesn't she?" a socialite snorted, barely hiding her amusement. Iris didn't flinch. She kept her head high, eyes scanning the room for a familiar face, though she knew none would offer her warmth. Not tonight. Her once mentor, now rival, stood at the center of the room like a queen on her throne. Mariana Duval, the darling of the fashion world, wrapped in a shimmering white column dress that probably cost more than Iris's rent for a year. Mariana saw her, smirked, then turned away. But the real sting came from Sophie, a former friend, now Mariana's right-hand woman, who offered a little gasp of mock delight. "Iris, darling, you made it." Sophie's voice oozed fake sweetness as she air-kissed the air near Iris's cheek. "Did you sneak in with the caterers, or was it an open invite this year?" Iris met her eyes calmly. "I was invited, Sophie, just like you." The air shifted. People were listening now, watching, waiting for the spectacle. Sophie blinked, then laughed loudly, clutching her champagne glass as if it were a prop. "How quaint," she replied, turning back toward the circle of elite influencers who had already begun tweeting snarky takes. As Iris made her way deeper into the gala, her discomfort was palpable. Waiters passed her without offering drinks. Fashion bloggers turned their backs as she walked by, careful not to capture her in their photos. A high-profile investor openly checked her out, and not in the flattering way, but with the smirk of someone eyeing a thrift store curiosity. She stopped in front of the gala's main exhibit, a massive LED wall displaying live donation pledges. The numbers rose in real time, linked to the social media handles of every donor. A competition masked as charity. Billionaire avatars floated next to 6- and 7-figure contributions. Iris glanced at the screen, then down at the envelope she still held in her hand. A young assistant approached her timidly. I think the coat check is that way. If you're looking for seating, I'm not sure if your name is." "I'm not looking for a seat," she said, softly but firmly. "I'm looking for a moment." The assistant blinked, unsure how to respond. From behind her, the crowd erupted into light applause as Mariana Duval ascended the stage. She smiled like a woman who'd already won before the game began. "Tonight," Mariana began, "we gather not just to raise money, but to celebrate the right kind of giving. Not charity for attention, but charity from legacy, from taste, from those who understand fashion's power to change the world." Iris felt the sting of those words, directed like daggers veiled in velvet. She looked at the assistant again, then pointed to the donation booth. "Can I submit my check now?" He nodded nervously, taking her envelope. She didn't need anyone to read the figure just yet. The moment wasn't ready. From afar, Mariana raised a glass and toasted to elevated generosity. The room echoed her words like a cult. Iris simply watched, silently out of place, but not for long. Tonight wasn't about fitting in. It was about being remembered. Before the silence of humiliation came the noise of ambition. There was a time not long ago when Iris's name rang like a promise in the corridors of fashion. She had come from nothing, no legacy, no connections, no wealth, only skill, grit, and vision. While others arrived with last names that opened doors, she carved her path with bleeding fingers and boundless sacrifice. Her early collections, sewn in the corners of a cramped apartment under flickering lights, had once turned heads at small showcases. Her designs spoke of authenticity, hand-woven integrity, and cultural reverence, quiet rebellion against mass-produced excess. It was during those early years that she met Mariana Duval, a legendary figure whose praise could mint careers. Mariana had been Iris's idol, sharp, accomplished, and ruthlessly influential. When Mariana invited her to assist on a couture line, it felt like destiny unfolding. Under her wing, Iris worked tirelessly, breathing life into sketches that Mariana barely glanced at before stamping her name on. At first, Iris didn't mind. She was learning, absorbing, believing in the promise of eventual recognition. And when she designed the award-winning Celestine gown, she had truly believed that she had arrived. But success has many fathers, none of whom acknowledged her. Mariana took full credit, parading the gown as her masterpiece, receiving accolades and standing ovations. Iris waited patiently, expecting even the smallest nod, a footnote in the press release, a thank you backstage. It never came. Instead, Mariana began subtly pushing her out of creative meetings, dismissing her suggestions, and assigning her to menial tasks. When Iris voiced concern, she was told she was being ungrateful. That she should be grateful to be near greatness at all. The betrayal wasn't just professional. It became personal the day Sophie, her closest confidant and the one friend who had walked the journey with her from the start, turned cold. Sophie had been her roommate during the early days, the one who once cried with her over shared failures, who helped pin fabric in the dead of night. But Sophie, hungry for her own ascension, saw a quicker path. She aligned herself with Mariana, who offered glittering promises in exchange for loyalty. Iris had found out only later, through a careless forwarded email, that Sophie had been leaking her original sketches to Mariana for months. And then came the scandal. It began with a lawsuit, fabricated, strategically planted. A former intern accused Iris of design theft and misconduct, armed with conveniently edited files and a paper trail too neat to be real. Her emails were selectively leaked, her contract terminated, and every major label cut ties. While she scrambled to defend herself, the industry simply moved on. No one stood up for her, not even those who had once called her a visionary. The media mocked her as a fraud who flew too close to the sun. Interviews dried up, invitations stopped, her brand, just weeks away from its breakout season, dissolved overnight. She returned to obscurity with nothing but shame and the echo of laughter from those galas she had once hoped to host. Her apartment shrank, her world shrank. The silence became unbearable, but she refused to let it define her. In that void, she began to rebuild, not for the world, but for herself. She took jobs teaching fashion to local women in underfunded community centers. She sold handmade pieces online, quietly amassing a cult following under a pseudonym. And in the shadows, she documented everything, every sketch stolen, every conversation recorded, every bank transfer, every lie. The industry had moved on, but she hadn't forgotten. In those 2 years, she had found her strength not in the applause of others, but in solitude. There were no runways in her life now, no flashing lights, but she had something more potent than fame. She had the truth, and she had the proof, but more than that, she had clarity. The illusion of glamour no longer seduced her. She had seen the machinery behind the facade, how quickly admiration turns to abandonment, how easily integrity is traded for access. Now, as the present-day charity gala glittered with familiar faces that had once turned away, she wasn't the same woman who had left crying after being escorted out of her final studio. She had walked into that room not seeking redemption from them, but as a witness to their descent. The past hadn't broken her. It had distilled her into something sharper, quieter, unshakable. And tucked within the envelope she had handed off earlier was not just a donation, it was the culmination of years of resilience. The amount, if revealed, would rattle the very foundation of the event. But it wasn't just about money, it was about message, that she had survived, that she had thrived, and that her silence had been strategy, not surrender. They had taken everything from her once, but now she was returning, not to ask for a seat at their table, but to flip it. The room pulsed with curated laughter and the static buzz of expensive cameras. Every gesture, every glance, every champagne toast was designed for optics. For those who lived and breathed the fashion world, this gala was more than a fundraiser, it was a battlefield of reputations. And Iris, despite her deliberate composure, was walking through the center of it like a soldier without armor. Word had spread faster than she expected. Her appearance, unannounced, unendorsed, and unfiltered, was enough to send a ripple of discomfort through the manicured crowd. It wasn't just that she had shown up, it was that she refused to disappear. From across the hall, a series of small gestures began to snowball. A stylist visibly recoiled after recognizing her, whispering into her phone, eyes darting toward Iris like she was a walking scandal. A circle of fashion influencers standing by the orchid arrangement tilted their heads in near unison as they examined her from afar, dissecting her look, her purpose, her presence. Their glossy smiles thinned into sneers, their fingers danced across phone screens, crafting captions that would soon ripple across the algorithm. Without a PR team to protect her, Iris became prey to the ambient cruelty of the elite. It wasn't overt, not yet, it never started that way. It began in subtleties, the drinks not offered, the seats conveniently reserved, the camera crew that angled away when she came into frame. Her mere existence was now a disruption to the narrative they had cultivated. She had been written off, discarded as a cautionary tale. To return uninvited was an act of rebellion, and that made her dangerous. Security took notice soon enough. Not because she was doing anything wrong, but because people with power had begun to look uncomfortable. Two guards approached her, their earpieces blinking with direction, their expressions blank with professional distance. They didn't touch her. They didn't need to. Their hovering presence was an accusation in itself. She felt the collective attention shift toward her, not out of curiosity, but with the energy of an audience expecting spectacle. Some even raised their phones in anticipation, as if humiliation had become performance art. What hurt more than the stares were the silences. People she had once helped, people whose portfolios she had nurtured, whose first catwalk she had choreographed, none of them met her gaze. It was as though she had become invisible to everyone except those who wanted to watch her fall again. She felt the online mob before she even opened her feed. The hashtags had already begun to trend, #ghost of Iris, crashing couture, Galagate. She knew the pattern well. It was a ritual now, one post snide and vague, then another more direct. Screenshots of her outfit, cruelly cropped and overexposed, were now being circulated with captions mocking her taste, her finances, her past. Memes bloomed like weeds, some calling her a relic, others accusing her of attention-seeking. Influencers fed the fire with faux innocent remarks laced with venom. A picture of her near the LED donation wall surfaced, accompanied by a comment suggesting she was just there to photograph someone else's generosity. What few people saw, what no camera captured, was the quiet strength in how she stood, how she refused to shrink. Every second she remained there unbroken was an act of resistance. But the assault continued. A well-known podcast host, live-streaming from the event, made her the centerpiece of his monologue, casually referring to her as fashion's forgotten ghost haunting the wrong party. Laughter echoed through his headset, the sound spilling into the room through shared earbuds and smug nods. Then came the final humiliation, a charity auction announcement. A dress, her original design, stolen and repackaged under Mariana's label, was placed on a mannequin at the front of the ballroom. The host announced it with flourish, describing the craftsmanship as a miracle of Mariana's vision. Applause rang out, loud and deliberate, with not a single name acknowledging the true creator. Iris stood only feet away, unseen in plain sight, watching her stolen legacy fetch praise and offers like a prize animal at a fair. And yet she didn't leave. Because this was the moment she had prepared for. To be mocked was expected, to be erased was routine, but none of it could touch her anymore. The crowd was laughing, yes, but the truth was no longer in their favor. They were laughing at a woman who had already walked through fire and emerged with her own matchbox. What they didn't know, what they hadn't seen yet, was that Iris hadn't come to prove anything. She had come to end it. The air in the ballroom was thick with a smugness only wealth could cultivate, an invisible perfume of old money, new influence, and curated cruelty. But beneath that polished sheen, a current had started to shift. It was almost imperceptible at first, like the subtle drop in pressure before a storm. Iris felt it before anyone else, the way gazes began to linger not with mockery, but with curiosity. Whispers had changed tone. The crowd, once entertained by her supposed downfall, now seemed unsure whether they had miscalculated. The shift began not with drama, but with precision. Behind the donation display screen, a quiet buzz of static signaled the start of a scheduled announcement. The crowd turned lazily, expecting another self-congratulatory message from a luxury sponsor or a slideshow of philanthropists in branded couture. But instead, a new figure took the stage, a young woman with a simple black blazer, a slick ponytail, and a name no one recognized. Myra Anand, the event's tech consultant, assigned to coordinate digital logistics and anonymous donation entries. Myra wasn't famous, but she had one advantage: she was on Iris's side. As the screen flickered to life, a single number appeared: $12 million, no logo, no donor, no fanfare, just the stark figure. It took a moment for the meaning to register. 12 million, quietly dropped into the system minutes before the auction, routed through a private fund with encrypted clearance. The room stilled. It was more than all other donations combined, more than any designer had ever given. The wealthiest moguls exchanged confused glances, unable to trace the source. Then the second wave hit. A new video played on the same screen, replacing the silent logo reel. It began with footage of a well-known design studio, Mariana Duval's flagship headquarters, a behind-the-scenes clip of a design meeting, voices overlapping. At first it seemed like promotional content, but then a timestamp appeared, and a voice undeniably Mariana's uttered words that hadn't been meant for public ears. Just lift Iris's embroidery, no one will know. That girl was a ghost before I found her. The silence was immediate and brutal. Myra, operating from the backstage console, cued the next file. Screenshots flooded the display, emails from Sophie forwarding Iris's sketches. Contracts doctored with inconsistent metadata. Anonymous whistleblower testimony from a former intern confirming the coordinated takedown. Legal disclaimers appeared, citing the source as part of an ongoing intellectual property investigation. No commentary was needed. The evidence stood alone. By the time the final slide appeared, a notarized affidavit from Iris's former attorney confirming that her exit from the industry had been engineered through false claims, the room had turned entirely. The influencers stopped filming. The PR representatives began texting furiously. Mariana, sitting front and center in a crimson gown, had frozen mid-sip, her glass trembling ever so slightly. Her carefully sculpted image had just cracked in front of hundreds of witnesses, and likely thousands online. And then finally, the most unexpected blow landed. The MC, recovering poorly, attempted to regain control of the moment by clarifying the donation's origin. He called over a staffer who whispered hastily into his ear. His face went pale. The check, the one that had triggered the digital avalanche, had been written not by a known brand or celebrity, but by a private foundation newly registered under the name, the Iris Aurora Endowment for Ethical Fashion. Gasps scattered like beads dropped from a broken necklace. Now people were truly looking at her not as a joke or a ghost, but as something else entirely. A force. A reckoning. She had walked into the gala alone, wrapped in a dress of her own making, and without uttering a word, she had turned the entire event on its axis. Where others had chosen fame, she had chosen facts. Where they performed wealth, she wielded it with surgical precision. Even more impressive than the sum she donated was the way she chose to do it, anonymously at first, letting the impact speak before the credit. In a world obsessed with performative charity, she had rewritten the rules. Her silence had never been weakness, it had been strategy. In the wake of the revelation, everything changed. Mariana's team began distancing themselves almost immediately. A well-known editor slipped out the back. Investors, sensing reputational risk, began messaging their legal teams. Journalists in attendance scrambled to gather quotes, their pens moving faster now that the narrative had flipped. A few approached Iris cautiously, but she declined attention simply by standing still. She let the facts echo without her voice. Her revenge wasn't loud, it wasn't vengeful. It was clinical, composed, and impossible to dismiss. And while everyone else scrambled to make sense of the evening, Iris watched with measured calm. The people who had erased her now scrambled to revise history. But she knew the truth would live longer than their temporary shame. What had just unfolded wasn't the climax, it was the beginning. This wasn't about validation, it was about control. And for the first time since her exile, Iris was the one holding the pen. There is a difference between being accused and being vindicated. The first stings, but the second silences a room. In the wake of the gala's unraveling, the crowd was no longer laughing, whispering, or even pretending to care about the silent auction. Faces had turned pale with realization, their curated expressions cracking under the pressure of what they had just witnessed. But the storm had only just begun. The truth didn't arrive in fury, it unfolded with deliberate grace. That very night, a digital press kit was quietly distributed to major media outlets, legal committees, and members of the Fashion Federation. The sender was anonymous on the surface, but the evidence was traceable, undeniable, and heavy with consequence. Each document was perfectly timestamped, authenticated through blockchain encryption, and cross-referenced with original submissions from the fashion archives, files only Iris herself could have retained. The first piece was a side-by-side comparison. Her original embroidery swatches, delicate, intricate, painstakingly hand-stitched, set against the mass-produced replica showcased under Mariana Duval's name. The replication wasn't just suspicious, it was identical. Every thread, every motif, every flawed corner Iris had deliberately left to signal authenticity had been copied. It wasn't inspiration, it was theft, and it was lazy. Next came the chain of communications. Dozens of internal emails between Mariana's creative director and Sophie, Iris's former friend-turned-betrayer, discussing how to scrub metadata from Iris's design files before repackaging them. The conversations were blunt, heartless, and transactional. No guilt, just strategy. In their world, ethics were a PR issue, not a principle. One thread stood out. In it, Mariana herself greenlit the process, writing, "She won't fight, she's humiliated. We'll bury her in headlines before she ever gets to a lawyer." But Iris had never intended to scream for attention. She had waited, she had watched, and she had armed herself with a truth so meticulously documented that no counter-narrative could survive it. The file that followed was perhaps the most damning of all. A legal deposition from her former attorney, now disbarred, who had been part of the scheme to sabotage her brand's IPO. The lawyer, under immunity, confessed to falsifying breach notices to scare off investors, orchestrated in exchange for a seat on the board of Mariana's parent company. With signatures, payment records, and bank transfers all neatly presented, the confession was complete. The conspiracy was not just creative theft, it was financial sabotage. At this point, the Fashion Federation could no longer afford to remain neutral. An emergency virtual session was convened the next morning. As committee members logged in from around the world, the evidence packets had already reached their inboxes. Industry veterans, some of whom had initially dismissed Iris's exit as personal failure, now sat in stunned silence as the findings were presented. Her work had not just been stolen, her entire legacy had been systematically dismantled to elevate someone else. The board passed an immediate resolution. Mariana Duval was to be suspended pending investigation, and all designs in question would be pulled from upcoming campaigns. The industry press, once gleefully complicit in Iris's downfall, now flipped the narrative with whiplash speed. Headlines began flooding in. The resurrection of Iris Aurora. Proof, power, and plagiarism, how one woman outsmarted fashion's elite. From outcast to architect, the quiet genius behind the $12 million donation. Meanwhile, investors tied to Mariana's label began to retreat. Her parent company's shares dropped 7% by noon. Sponsorships were withdrawn. Brand ambassadors cut ties in carefully worded statements about alignment and integrity. The house that had mocked Iris was collapsing, not in rage, but under the unbearable weight of truth. And Iris, she didn't gloat. She didn't post vindicating videos, didn't comment on the scandals erupting in every fashion blog, didn't sit for interviews. Her silence now carried power, not pain. Let the evidence speak. Let the systems answer for themselves. The files were enough. She didn't need to scream to be heard. She had documented everything with the discipline of someone who knew no one would believe her without receipts. For every betrayal, she had a folder. For every lie told in press, she had timelines. Her refusal to break, to strike back prematurely, had been mistaken for weakness. Now it was being redefined as strategy. In a final move that few anticipated, Iris uploaded her full collection archives, designs she had locked away for years, to an open-source platform for aspiring designers. In doing so, she not only reclaimed her legacy but seeded a new generation of ethical creators. The gesture sent a message far louder than revenge: the work would always outlive the noise. That was her greatest proof, not just the documents or the signatures or the whistleblowers, but her continued presence, her refusal to disappear. She had survived not by adapting to their system, but by waiting for the moment to unmake it. And now, with the world watching, Iris wasn't just back. She was undeniable. The fall didn't come with sirens or screams, it came with silence. A still, echoing quiet that followed each email notification, each lawyer's call, each unread message piling up in Mariana Duval's inbox. By the time she stepped into her office 3 days after the gala, the empire she once ruled with silver spoon certainty had already begun to rot from the inside. The walls, once covered with press clippings and framed editorials singing her praise, now seemed like reminders of a lie grown too large to contain. Her team, usually composed and rehearsed, no longer met her gaze. Eyes darted. Whispered calls were made behind closed doors. No one said it aloud, but she could feel it. She had become toxic. The first to go were the investors. Private equity groups that had once flaunted their partnerships with Duval Studios began issuing vague press releases distancing themselves from ongoing legal matters. Bank accounts were frozen pending litigation. Her CFO, usually robotic in tone, sounded like a funeral director when he informed her that 2 of their core backers had pulled out within 24 hours of the Federation's suspension order. Then came the PR unraveling. Mariana's publicist, who had been her sharpest weapon for a decade, resigned with a single-line email: "We can no longer represent your brand in good faith." Media outlets that once scrambled for her attention were now leading the charge in dissecting her fall. Talk shows invited former interns to describe the culture inside her firm. Stylists posted Instagram stories about stolen credit and intimidation. Even those who had profited from her reign began rewriting their histories, eager to escape the sinking ship with clean hands. The brand's e-commerce site saw record traffic, but not the good kind. The comments section on every product was flooded with hashtags: "Stolen designs, I stand with Iris, ethical fashion now." Influencers who had worn Duval gowns suddenly claimed they'd always felt uncomfortable with the company's ethics. A-list celebrities returned their custom pieces under the guise of alterations, never to be worn again. The signal was clear: the industry was excommunicating her. Inside her office, Mariana tried to hold the illusion of control. She demanded staff meetings, issued cease and desist threats, and ordered press counterstatements. But no one followed through. Her own assistant stopped showing up. Emails went unanswered. The building, once buzzing with ambition and false flattery, now echoed with a hollow quiet. A knock on the door broke the silence, but it wasn't the kind she welcomed. The legal courier delivered a thick envelope: official notice from the Fashion Federation. Her license to show at upcoming fashion weeks had been revoked. Every collaboration, every sponsorship, every scheduled campaign had been canceled pending investigation. Her name was now attached to scandal, not style. The blow that hurt most didn't come from a lawsuit or a fine, it came from the loss of relevance. Once the queen of curated opulence, she had become a cautionary tale, an industry joke dressed in couture. Her influence no longer opened doors, it closed them. Interns now used her name as an example of how not to treat designers. She had gone from legend to liability in under a week. And Iris hadn't even needed to speak a word. That was the part Mariana couldn't stomach. That the woman she dismissed as invisible had dismantled her without theatrics or spectacle. No interviews, no retaliation, just proof meticulously kept and publicly released at the right time. The check had silenced the billionaires, yes, but it had also exposed how hollow they were. Iris had shown the world that integrity, when armed with evidence, was stronger than legacy when built on lies. By the end of the week, Duval Studios shuttered its flagship store. The press called it a temporary hiatus, but insiders knew it was permanent. Whispers circled about bankruptcy filings and creative directors fleeing to competitor houses. Even the marble signage was taken down, replaced with brown paper as contractors stripped the boutique of its glamour. And Iris, she didn't appear, she didn't tweet, she didn't watch the building fall. Because real power doesn't need to watch its enemies crumble, it knows they will. In the wake of destruction, silence lingered, not the suffocating kind that once followed Iris through gala halls and studio corridors, but a clean, expectant silence. The kind that arrives just before dawn when everything feels possible and the past no longer matters. While the fashion world scrambled to realign itself, agencies pivoting, designers deleting old collaborations, and bloggers rewriting their opinions, Iris began again. Not with noise or spectacle, but with intention. Her re-entry wasn't announced with a press release or social media teaser. It began quietly, inside a modest industrial loft tucked in the garment district. There were no crystal chandeliers, no polished gold plaques, just exposed brick, open light, and bolts of fabric stacked beside old sketchbooks she hadn't touched in years. She called it Aurora Atelier, not to prove a point, but to reclaim the name that had once been reduced to a footnote in someone else's biography. It was hers again, not as a label but as a legacy, and this time she would build it from truth. The team she gathered reflected that spirit. There were no glossy resumes, no clout-chasing interns. Instead, she brought in those who had been overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside like she once had. A pattern maker who'd been blacklisted for standing up to a major label. A young assistant who left fashion school after being mocked for choosing sustainable fabrics over trend-chasing. A seamstress in her 50s who had been quietly let go during corporate downsizing. These were not proteges. They were survivors, and in Iris's hands, they were architects of the future. The studio pulsed with quiet energy. Mornings began with tea, not tension. Laughter replaced the sharp bark of former bosses. Mistakes weren't punished, they were dissected, learned from, and then transformed. Ideas flowed freely, walls were covered in sketches and textile swatches, and meetings ended in applause rather than passive-aggressive silence. It wasn't just a workspace, it was a healing ground. Iris's designs didn't chase the moment, they created it. Each piece was rooted in story. Threads told truths. Silhouettes reclaimed softness as strength. Her new collection was a tapestry of cultural echoes, ancestral inspiration, and fierce individuality. Gone were the desperate bids to impress the elite. Now the only measure of success was authenticity. And people noticed. Without a single ad campaign, Aurora Atelier began trending. Not because influencers were paid, but because they were moved. One post led to another. A fashion editor wore her hand-draped sari jacket hybrid to an awards gala and credited Iris by name. A global art museum reached out to feature her designs in an exhibit on resilience and reclamation. Small orders began trickling in, then larger ones. Within weeks, her waitlist outpaced entire legacy brands. But Iris never rushed. She refused to let momentum swallow the soul of her work. Each order was handcrafted, each fabric traceable, each artisan paid in full and credited. Her studio became a pilgrimage site for fashion students and ethical entrepreneurs, not because it was trendy, but because it was honest. Even those who had once betrayed her watched in quiet awe. Sophie, the former friend who had sold Iris's work for power, now sat behind a desk at a fatting PR firm, watching the world shift toward the very integrity she once mocked. Mariana Duval's name, once etched into glass, was now a cautionary whisper among interns, spoken in boardrooms only when referencing failed brand ethics. Iris never mentioned them. She didn't need to. Her revenge wasn't a headline, it was a harvest of reputation restored, of community rebuilt, of artistry returned to the hands of its rightful owner. Perhaps the most beautiful moment of her rebirth came when a young woman, barely 20, wearing second-hand denim and fire in her eyes, knocked on the studio door one afternoon. She had no portfolio, no formal education, only a sketchbook filled with raw brilliance and the courage to ask for a chance. Iris flipped through the pages slowly. The lines were unrefined, but the vision was pure. She smiled and handed the sketchbook back. "Welcome home," she said simply. The team made space, the girl stayed. That was Iris's greatest triumph, not the downfall of the billionaires, but the rise of the forgotten. not the reclaiming of her past, but the building of something new, something she could pass forward. And though the cameras now lingered, though interview requests poured in, though the world was eager to drape her in praise, she stayed steady, graceful, quiet. She knew fame was fleeting, but truth endured, and her truth, stitched into every hem, was now a light no one could ignore. She didn't need to return to their world. She had created her own. The gala was different this time, not in its glamour that remained as polished and ostentatious as ever, but in its undercurrent. The air held a strange tension, not of anticipation, but of quiet shame. The same luxury cars pulled up to the venue, the same diamond-draped patrons walked the crimson runway, but their eyes no longer held certainty. They scanned the room differently now, less assured, more cautious, because in the aftermath of scandal, every glance had consequences. And at the center of it all stood a name reborn, Iris Aurora. Her invitation had arrived hand-delivered, embossed with gold and signed personally by the new board of the Fashion Federation, not as a guest, not as an attendee, but as the honorary speaker and featured designer of the year. She hadn't planned to go. The idea of returning to the same place that once chewed her up, spat her out, and left her invisible beneath chandeliers and smirks had no appeal. But it wasn't about her anymore. The team she had built, the women she mentored, the movement she sparked, they needed her presence. To see that someone who had once been dismissed as a nobody could now stand at the podium and be heard. So she dressed not in something borrowed, not in something strategic. She wore a piece from her own collection, hand-dyed by one of her interns, embroidered by a local artisan collective she'd helped fund. It was soft but commanding, regal but rooted. It wasn't designed to turn heads, it was meant to lift hearts. When she arrived, cameras that had once turned away now clicked like thunder. Journalists leaned forward, hopping for sound bites or scandal, but Iris moved through them like wind through silk, calm, unbothered, radiant in stillness. Inside the venue, there was no denying the shift. The same billionaires who once ignored her now sat straighter, their applause slightly too eager. Faces that had once sneered now bore forced smiles. Whispers followed her, but they were different now, no longer dismissive, now reverent, even cautious. As she approached the stage, the lights dimmed. A hush fell across the room. The spotlight found her not by demand, but by right. The Federation's president introduced her, words tumbling over accolades. Visionary, ethical trailblazer, the woman who redefined luxury from the ground up. But Iris didn't smile at the praise. She hadn't come for validation. She had come for truth. She stepped to the podium and let the silence stretch. Then softly, steadily, she began. "I was once told I didn't belong here," she said. "Not because I lacked talent, but because I lacked lineage, because I didn't speak their language, wear their labels, or know the right people to protect me. I was invisible until I was." No applause interrupted her. The room hung on every word. "They stole my work, they erased my name, they built towers out of my silence and stood on them as if they had climbed." A few guests shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable. "But truth," she continued, "doesn't vanish, it waits. It waits for the right moment, the right light, and when it comes, even the loudest lies dissolve." She paused, looked around the room. "I didn't come back for revenge. I came back to open the door they tried to close forever. For every woman who was told she wasn't refined enough, or wealthy enough, or white enough. For every artist who was dismissed for choosing honesty over performance." And then her voice softened, but the words landed like a hammer. "I am not the exception, I am the beginning." The standing ovation that followed was not just loud, it was sincere. And from the back row, a young girl in a thrifted blazer wiped her tears. From the balcony, a former assistant now running her own studio whispered, "She did it." From across the room, once powerful mogul sat in stunned silence, realizing that Iris Aurora had become untouchable, not because of wealth, but because of integrity. After the speech, she didn't linger. She walked down the stairs of the grand hall, past the curated marble and strategically positioned media walls, past the handlers who once overlooked her, past the influencers who now begged for quotes. She exited through a quiet side door where a black cab waited, not a limo, not a flashy SUV. Inside the cab, she exhaled for the first time that night, not out of relief but release. The weight was gone. She had said what needed saying, not just for herself, but for every version of her that had ever been silenced, laughed at, or pushed aside. Her phone buzzed, a message from one of her interns. "We watched from the studio, you were fire, thank you for making room for us." She smiled, not the proud kind, the peaceful kind. As the cab drove off, leaving the glittering venue behind, Iris looked out the window, not at the crowd, not at the lights, but at the skyline beyond it all. Her city, her story. She had not conquered their world. She had changed it.